Good evening. My name is Josef Sorett. I'm a professor of religion and African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. It's a privilege to welcome you to the next iteration of our summer-long series, Religion and the History of Black Music, from the rise of gospel to the reign of hip hop. And this is a sort of a bridge week. This, just to give you all a broader context, this is episode 3 or event 3 in a 6-part series of summer public events that are tied to 2 courses I'm teaching at Columbia this summer. First course was Gospel Music in Modern America. We wrapped that up last week. And on Monday, I will start up that second class, Religion and the History of Gospel Music. And this conversation this evening helps us thread the needle between these 2 genres, these 2 moments, these 2 periods. Of course, gospel music does not come to an end with the rise of hip hop, but our series will transition from thinking about sacred music to thinking about a music that has often been described as profane, if you will, but still is so rife with religious sentiments. In case you missed our first 2 events, you can now check them out on YouTube or via the series website, which is now up in the chat. Thank you, Angie. Event 1 featured 3 amazing Columbia undergraduates. You can find that up there. And then event 2 featured ethnomusicologist and Juilliard professor Claudrena Harold. Tonight is our 3rd event where we'll be thinking about, discussing, and listening to trajectories in contemporary gospel. I'm joined by Professor Claudrena Harold, about whom I will tell you a bit more in a few moments. I should say that June is Black Music Month. It comes to an end in just a few days, but we'll be continuing this conversation with 3 more events that will come to a conclusion on August 4th, focusing more particularly on the religious dimensions of hip hop's history. On July 7th, I won't tell you who will be joining me, but I'll give you a couple of hints. On July 7th, we'll be joined by a senior scholar who gave me my first academic job researching religion and hip hop. On July 21st, we'll be joined by a colleague of mine in Morningside Heights at one of Columbia's schools, who's both a scholar and a public intellectual working in the space of hip hop. And on August 4th, well, I'm not going to say anything more about our closing event yet. You'll just have to come back and find out who's going to help us bring this series to a close. Before we move into our conversation, again, I want to thank Louise Rosen and the entire SPS team who has helped to make this event go, everything from getting our speakers lined up to getting all the tech in order. We appreciate everything they're doing behind the scenes to help each of these events go off without a hitch. I want to thank everyone, both at Columbia and beyond, who helped to crowdsource the playlists that are assigned and attached to each of our 6 conversations. You can also check those out on the website, so you can continue to listen to the music in between our events. I want a special thanks in this regard to a Columbia student who was in my gospel music class, Malik Johnson, who helped to get all of those songs organized chronologically in each of those playlists. And then I also finally want to thank all of you who have offered questions in advance when registering via Eventbrite. Quick overview of tonight's conversation. We'll have about 40 minutes of dialogue and music with me and Professor Harold. Following that, we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. I want to, in that regard, invite you, as questions come to your mind, please post that in the Q&A section of chat. If you don't have a question but have a comment, we want to make sure that this hour is a dialogue. Please feel free to comment on the music or anything that I or Professor Harold might say in the chat space. Join the conversation. Let's take full advantage of the technology and what it makes possible. So any thought, personal, academic, or otherwise, that you may have about any of the selections or any of the comments, please weigh in and join the conversation this evening by using the chat space. All right, that's all the logistics for the evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest for this evening. Claudrena Harold is professor and chair of the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She is also professor of African American and African Studies there at UVA. She's the author of 3 books: The Rise and Fall of the Garvey Movement in the Urban South, New Negro Politics in the Jim Crow South, and most recently, When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. She's co-edited 2 volumes, The Punitive Turn, New Approaches to Race and Incarceration, and Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Inequity. In addition to all of her writing, as part of her ongoing work on the history of Black student activism at UVA, she has co-directed with Kevin Everson 9 short films as well. Please join me in welcoming, as much as we can in this virtual space, Professor Claudrena Harold. Claudrena, it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for agreeing and saying yes. It's not quite the opportunity for me to return the favor of the invitation you extended to me a couple years ago for that tribute conference to Katie Cannon and James Cone as part of the Race, Religion, and Democracy Lab down there at UVA, when I had the opportunity both to hang out with you and meet your colleague and co-filmmaker, Kevin Everson, and many others in the UVA community. But I am glad to be able to connect in this space and to hear more about your work and to hear more about these songs that you've selected. So welcome, Claudrena.
Thanks for having me.
As I have, I guess just as we'll jump right into this conversation, and I know everybody is eager to hear the music, but before we do that, I want to give you an opportunity to say a little bit more about your work, and especially your most recent work, and then also a little bit about your process for the songs that we're going to hear and talk about this evening. So you are the author of 3 books. One might make an observation, right? The first 2 very clearly in the realm of politics, right? And with this 3rd one, When Sunday Comes, you make what seems to be, at least for an outsider unfamiliar with your work, a turn from politics to the arts, right? What also might be observed as a turn from secular to sacred. That's right, a broad stroke. But I am curious just to hear about how you came to write this book about gospel music, and what were you thinking about? What were you trying to get at? What tell us a little bit more about the story behind the story and the story you were telling in When Sunday Comes.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a blessing to be in conversation with you. You know, I've said this a lot, but music is my sanctuary, and so it has always been a part of who I am and also what I think about. As I think a student of history, but also someone who comes out of Black studies. It was a part of my childhood. It's a part of my family history. When I think about my undergraduate years at Temple University, playing on a basketball team, some of my most vivid memories of that time was, traveling from New York to Philadelphia on the bus, listening to music with my teammates. And invariably there would be a moment where we would move from, Biggie to Shirley. And
seamlessly.
And we would listen to music, and we would listen to gospel music. It was a central part of our listening experience. So I can think about those bonding moments of listening to James Cleveland and the Winans and Commission. And also the conversations that we had about the music, what the music said. Amiri Baraka has that quote where he says, sound carries ideas. And so collectively, we often talked about the sounds, but we also talked about the ideas in the music. And so while I didn't write about gospel music until 2012, and it was somewhat scary, it's always been a part of me. It's always been also a part of my pedagogical sort of experiences as a teacher. And so I began to sort of move in that direction by 2012. And as someone who taught classes on the history of African-American music, I was often disappointed with the what I saw as the marginalization of gospel music and the story of of music and its impact on Black people politically, socially, and intellectually. And as someone who grew up in the 1980s, yeah, I can quote Rakim, I can quote Run DMC and Salt and Pepper, but I can also quote every lyric of, like Commission's first 4 albums, or the
Absolutely.
Shirley Caesar. And so I wanted to, I think, tell the story of an art form that shaped me tremendously. And so When Sunday Comes tells the story of gospel music's commercial growth and its sonic evolution during the last 3 decades of the 20th century. It basically spans the years between the release of Edwin Hawkins' crossover smash, Oh Happy Day, which was released in 1967, but really begins to climb the charts in 1968, and Kirk Franklin's meteoric rise in 1994. Of course, his debut album was released in 1993, but it is in 1994 when we begin to see the album just explode on the R&B charts. And so I know I wanted to look at that period from 1967, 1968 to 1994, not just because of, starting in 1968, not just because of Edwin Hawkins, but also thinking about the formation of James Cleveland's Gospel Music Workshop of America, because I wanted to tell the story of gospel music from a commercial perspective, but I also wanted to tell the story of gospel music in terms of institution building. And so this is a book that highlights the brilliant sonic innovations of some of gospel's biggest stars, the centrality of Black institutions in the genre's growth, the complex and often contradictory political messages within the music, within Black sacred music, and how it has also been intertwined and connected to what Amiri Baraka calls spirit music. Yes, so I also wanted to write a book in which James Cleveland was in conversation with Donald Byrd, a book in which the sounds of Blackness was in conversation with Katie Cannon or James Cone, and understanding how sometimes these formations, these artistic formations, but also these literary and theological formations, Christian formations, emerge from the same soil. At the same time, I want to position gospel music and gospel musicians at the forefront of artistic innovation in post-civil rights Black popular culture. And to not just look at gospel music as this art form that had its golden age from the 1930s to the 1960s, and then just began to sort of be too consumed with funk and R&B. So I really wanted to say we can't understand Black popular culture without looking at gospel music and the innovations within the art form.
So that's actually leads me to the next question. You bring up the language of post-civil rights, right? When I was in our previous conversation, my conversation with Professor Claudrena Harold, we were talking about the golden age, which is certain kind of circumscribed within the period of Jim Crow. Right. And so you talk about 1968, Oh Happy Day. One could read it as a declaration of a people that have finally arrived in the promised land, right? As sort of aspirational hopefulness. I don't think that's how we want to read it. But I wonder, like, as this music is making a whole set of market shifts in light of shifting political variables, but not only in that regard, how did you go about thinking about your 5 selections? How did you arrive at the songs that you chose to help us think about the sort of Black gospel music in the post-civil rights era? What kinds of things were you thinking about as a historian? And maybe even, what was the toughest song for you not to include on this impossible task of 5 songs?
Right, and so this was a very cruel exercise.
Thank you. You're welcome.
To limit the evolution of gospel music to 5 songs. I mean, it would have been difficult to just do 20. And I had 20, and I was hoping that you would just let me do 20, but you did not. You limited to 5, and so I think the strategy was to pick 5 songs that transformed the genre sonically and commercially, to pick 5 songs that, in my opinion, if they were not created, we would not be having this conversation.
Okay.
I'm not so sure we would be having this conversation without, say, the release of Aretha's Amazing Grace. to also pick songs where I could cheat. And so
Okay,
I
okay.
clearly picked Aretha Franklin and James Cleveland's not Amazing Grace, but Precious Memories, because I could talk about them both in covering this song. And also because it comes off of her iconic 1972 classic, Amazing Grace. Of course, 1972 is also the year she released Young, Gifted, and Black. But this is a seminal record. A record that I think captures spirit music. I think it's a record that blurs the lines and really shatters the lines between this notion of sacred and the secular. It was a record because it sold 500 million copies that many record companies saw gospel, envisioned gospel as this art form that could do certain things. And so that sort of shaped, I wanted to also capture the diversity of the sound and the change. And so I wanted to do Andre Crouch and some other people.
Oh, we don't want to tell everybody too much about that.
Okay. So I'll just say this. So it was very hard. It was very difficult. I appreciate the songs. I probably would have preferred to be able to do albums, because one of the things I also want to do in this book is to get people to sort of think about gospel music as also a genre that releases these classic albums.
Yes.
During this period that I'm talking about. And so I think that's one of the defining characteristics about the music in this period, is that you have these albums that are spectacular from beginning to end. But you know, the 12-year-old in me just thinks that I'm not going to say how could I have a list without certain people, but I would just say there are a couple of artists that are like my favorites that are not in this top 5.
And I was going to say, I had the opportunity to see your longer list, like your refusal of the exercise,
right.
But then and I was saddened to see that Ordinary Just Won't Do did not make it onto the final list, because right, for me, college was unimaginable without commission.
Exactly. Right?
From the house party on a campus like Oral Roberts University to Loving You for the Rest of My Life, right off of number 7.
Right.
I would be remiss if I didn't give you, and I know it's not on the 5, and we'll get to the 5, which you've already set up well, but tell, and this is part of also why, one of the things that was a highlight for me of reading your book is to actually get to read about commission, right? But tell folks who are listening a little bit about Ordinary Just Won't Do.
Ordinary Just Won't Do is classic album by commission. I think it was released in 1989. They signed with Light Records in 1985, and really from 1985 till I think the release of 7, they just have a series of classic albums, and for those of us who were hardcore gospel fans and found ourselves in church a lot, there was always these debates about commission or the Winans, who was the best. And but Ordinary Just Won't Do, it is a song that sort of classic commission ballad, features the brilliant writing of Fred Hammond and Michael Brooks, and also that signature commission harmony. Sometimes people will refer to commission as the Mel Clark sisters. And of course, the commission emerges from that great genealogy of Detroit, and also the Church of God in Christ. And so, you can pick Aretha and get, get through Mattie Moss Clark and then the Clark sisters and the Winans and all of that. But for me, Ordinary Just Won't Do is a song that really captured, I think, the hearts and the minds of a lot of young people in the 80s who were navigating coming of age, navigating Christianity, navigating what it meant to engage in discipleship, navigating what it meant to be, Christian in a sort of post-industrial world, just very powerful lyrics that have this sort of existential crisis bent. It is almost like Fred Hammond and Michael Brooks are like also the children of Andre Crouch. And so it's quiet music. And it's also music that's for the studio. I mean, there's a certain kind of thing that could happen, I think, in the studio where people engage in critical sort of reflection about life, about religion, about politics. And Ordinary Just Won't Do, is that kind of that kind of song, you know, that deals with some of those issues. So it's monumental and critical for me. I mean, I can still remember purchasing that album in Gospel World in Jacksonville, Florida. I can still smell it.
Yeah.
What the tape smelled like, you know, and getting that and seeing those brothers in those like Miami Vice suits and stuff, you know.
Yep.
So it was that was classic, and so that's like very, very important for me.
Absolutely. I used
sometimes serenity, sometimes there's misery. You know, that's some of the lyrics that, you know.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, it takes me back to my freshman dorm room out in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the stress and just putting on Ordinary Just Won't Do. I used to joke and say that the many churches that I attended during college, commission was really my pastor, right? Just the music is what got me through. All right, so you've already queued up our first selection. So I'm just gonna turn it over to our media team. And Jono, please play the excerpt from our first track, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Claudrena, to see if anything more you want to say about this first song.